Michael, the archangel, Mars and his angels, will fight a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns. In a revelation to Joseph Smith, the Lord revealed that Michael's angels are the hosts of heaven, that is, the planets and other heavenly bodies. Among Michael's angels will likely be its 2 moons along with the rocky debris trailing the planet, electrically machined from its surface by Earth and/or Venus. Anciently, the red planet was seen to have a trailing entourage of warriors. They were cometary in appearance. Immanuel Velikovsky described them as a troop following their leader. The Hindu Indra, another avatar of Mars, was associated with the Maruts, which were described in the Rig Veda as a heavenly army. Joel described the heavenly soldiers as a great army that will make the earth quake and the heavens tremble. The dragon will not prevail against Michael or the woman or her child. Instead, the dragon will be cast from heaven to earth. From the point of view of interpretation and not from a physical aspect, Jesus Christ and his archangel Michael will defeat Satan, the accuser, through the power and atoning blood of Christ. The dragon will not be slain, but will take out his anger on the church and the inhabitants of earth. As we know, the woman will be protected against the persecution of the dragon, meaning the church will be protected from Satan. With the woman out of reach, the dragon will turn his wrath to the righteous seed of the woman. What John describes after the departure of the woman is of a more physical nature. The dragon will cast out a flood, hoping to drown the woman, but the earth will swallow the floodwaters up. Now we know that the body of the standing form of the dragon is the Axis Mundi. The red color of the axis from the dust of Mars gives the dragon's body its color. The heads of the dragon are at the summit of the Axis Mundi, meaning that the water that will come from its mouth will also be at the summit. This can only mean that its body, the Axis Mundi, will be filled with water enough to flood the earth. The question naturally arises, how will a very large amount of water come to be suspended along the Axis Mundi? The body of the dragon will be filled with dusty water, making its body red. The water will rise from the earth to the head of the dragon near the planet Mars above. Gravity alone cannot pull water to such heights or in the form of a column. Biblical commentators are at a loss as to how to interpret this verse. Some throw up their hands, claiming that what John describes is physically impossible. But what John saw does occur in nature. There is a physical force that can explain the imagery in literal terms. It's called electricity. The most famous event in the Exodus was the parting of the Sea of Passage, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land. The account of Moses provides an explanation for the formation of two walls of water. It was a strong east wind that divided the waters. In his song after the deliverance, Moses repeated the claim that the walls of water were formed by a strong wind, which he calls the blast of the Lord's nostrils. Unfortunately, any directional wind would have caused only one wall to form. During the so-called Tunguska event, for example, a wall of water was formed on the Angara River by a strong wind. But the wind, if it was the wind, only formed one wall, not two. The furious wind driving the jaredite barges caused gigantic waves, but did not divide the sea. The whole point of having sealed barges was the fact that, unlike the Israelites who walked across the bottom of the sea, the Jaredites would be buried in the waters. When Joshua and the Israelites crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, the waters of the river rose up in a heap, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land. The biblical account does not record that there is a wind driving the wall of water. The water, which came from above, simply rose up in a heap, while the water from the direction of the Salt Sea were cut off. The truth of the matter is that any wind blowing in one direction does not create two walls of water. The electrical force, on the other hand, can cause water to separate and form two opposing walls. In a unique laboratory experiment, a powerful magnet was placed near the center of a tank of water. When turned on, the magnetic field caused the water to part in the middle with two opposing walls of water. The experimenters purposely dyed the water red in recognition of the Exodus event. For the waters of the Red Sea to part, as in the experiment, there must have been an electromagnetic field. In turn, for an electromagnetic field to have been created, there must be an electrical current. For electric currents and only electric currents form magnetic fields. We know that there was electrical activity during the Exodus, and specifically during the dividing of the waters. Lightning, a form of electrical discharge, lightened the entire planet when Israel was led through the sea. The electrical activity that caused the dividing of the waters was certainly not everyday lightning. In fact, the magnitude of the event is not fully captured in the Exodus account. According to the 104th Psalm, the waters were raised so high that they stood above the mountains. The 107th Psalm goes further, saying that the waves mounted up to heaven. This is not mere poetic license. The heaven referred to was the visible abode of the planetary gods above. The rabbinical commentaries of the Bible, known as the Midrashim, claim that the waters piled up to a height of 1,600 miles. And moreover, the walls of water could be seen by all the nations of the world. Another famous commentator, Rashi, interpreted the verse in Exodus speaking of the division of the waters to mean that it wasn't just the Red Sea that was divided, but all the oceans and seas of the world. Now, these claims may appear at first glance to be absurd exaggerations, but they're not as far-fetched as they seem. An unknown psalmist in Psalm 33 proclaimed that all the earth should fear the Lord and its inhabitants should stand in awe of his power to gather the waters in a heap. Of course, such an event would not have caused fear or awe if it had not first been seen by everyone on the earth. Electromagnetic activity of this magnitude requires another very large charged body, a planet near to the Earth. Immanuel Velikovsky understood this requirement. This fresco of the crossing depicts the presence of a star over the Sea of Passage. David Talbot explains that in an electric universe, the planets are charged bodies. When they approach each other, electrical discharges will necessarily occur due to their differing potentials. The plasma formations he mentions did exist during the Exodus, including the pillar of fire and cloud.
In an electric solar system, if two planets or moons approach each other from regions of different potential, electric discharge will occur, producing plasma formations stretching between the approaching bodies.
The charged planetary body over the Sea of Passage was Mars. Now, we've documented that Mars was present during the Exodus and played an active role as the angel of the Lord. It was Mars that caused the plagues and other afflictions during the Exodus. It was also Mars that caused the sea to rise and divide. And just before Moses lifted his rod to divide the sea, Mars, as the angel of God, moved and positioned its column, the pillar of fire and cloud, in between the Israelites and the Egyptian host. After Israel had crossed the sea, and as the Egyptians were ready to attack, Mars, as the Lord with his pillar, troubled the Egyptians, slowing them in their attack. It was at this point that Moses stretched forth his rod to command the sea to return. The rabbis say that the water was glass-like, solid, and massive. This description of the seawater forming the walls fits what is scientifically called the fourth phase of water, known as easy water or structured water. Easy water is structured in a crystalline form, different from both ice and normal water. Normal water, called bulk water, when it comes in contact with the surface, creates what is called an exclusion zone along the interface. It is called an exclusion zone because its crystalline structure excludes everything but its own phase of water. Easy water is different from normal water in all respects, including its chemical formula. That easy water is more viscous and dense plays into the rabbinical narrative of water that was solid and appeared like glass. For our purposes, it is important to note that water transforms into crystalline water at the water-air interface. This means that where all bodies of water from ocean to pond intersect with the atmosphere, an easy layer exists at the surface of the water. This would include the waters of the Sea of Passage at the Exodus. Easy water's crystalline structure gives the surface of water a glassy appearance, as described by the rabbis. The easy layer on all surfaces of water is also highly viscous and acts as an elastic sheet. This allows some insects and lizards to walk on water. It may also explain, at least partially, this miracle. In addition to the waters of the Sea of Passage being glassy, they were solid and massive. Easy water is not solid, but it is crystalline and has been described as gel-like. Easy properties would have allowed the two walls of water to maintain their shape throughout the event. Easy water's high viscosity explains the tensile strength of a water bridge as it is pulled apart. Easy water also gives coherent and enduring structure to such things as tsunami waves and water spouts. Without easy water's viscous and crystalline structure, water formations such as these would quickly dissipate or not form at all. At the same time the mountainous walls of water were rising above the earth, a battle was occurring in the heavens. The Lord fought the dragon, Rahab. The prophet Isaiah recounted the battle. The psalmist Ethan the Ezrahite also preserved the story. Job saw the event from his vantage point in the land of Uz. The King James Version translates the original Hebrew, Rahab, as the proud, but other translations prefer to leave Rahab untranslated. Elsewhere, the dragon is called Leviathan. According to rabbinical sources, as Immanuel Velikovsky pointed out, it was the archangel Michael, whom we have identified as Mars, who fought and vanquished the dragon. Michael fighting the dragon in the apocalypse will be a return engagement. The dragon of the Exodus was similar to the dragon of the Apocalypse. It had many heads. The scriptures do not designate the number of heads, but iconographically speaking, there were 7. Isaiah prophesied that Leviathan would reappear during the apocalypse. In other words, the red, 7-headed dragon of Revelation is the Leviathan of the Exodus. The description given by John fits Rahab or Leviathan of the Old Testament. However sparse the description of the dragon of the Exodus is in the Old Testament, we do have other testimony. After all, the nations of the ancient world saw the parting of the sea and the dragon combat and recorded it. The Russian hero rescued the princess by killing a 3-headed dragon, a parallel to Saint Michael saving the women clothed in the sun by slaying the great red dragon. The clearest and most detailed accounts come from Greek mythology. Heracles, the Greek Hercules, slew the many-headed Hydra as his second labor. The Hydra was a spawn of Typhon, who was also a multi-headed dragon. Like the dragon of John's Revelation, Typhon was killed and cast down to earth. In his theogony, Hesiod described the catastrophic conditions on the earth during the celestial combat between Zeus and Typhon. Now, these conditions are the same as described by the Bible during the Exodus. According to Hesiod, the earth melted like tin. Psalms related that the hills melted like wax at the Exodus. Psalms also recorded that the earth itself melted. Fierce winds created havoc and destruction on sea and on land. The Old Testament also records that there were fierce winds, some sinking ships. These same catastrophes will strike the earth when Michael battles the great red dragon. The accounts of the dragon combat throughout the ancient world testify that the many-headed dragon was defeated by the thunderbolt hurled by the warrior hero. Often, the thunderbolt is depicted as a Vajra, the Hindu version of the thunderbolt. Zeus holds this type of thunderbolt in his hand as he threatens Hydra. In other versions of the story, the hero's thunderbolt is a spear or sword. The archangel Michael carries the sword. Even so, in many depictions, like this stained glass representation, his sword retains its fiery aspect as a thunderbolt. The Bible describes the Lord's thunderbolt as a shining, glittering spear or an arrow or sword. However, having a spear, sword, or arrows doesn't necessarily mean that the Lord or his agent Michael used it against the dragon. There is biblical evidence that supports the idea that the dragon of the Exodus was defeated by lightning or an electrical discharge. The psalmist declared that the Lord broke Rahab in pieces. Rahab was killed as one slain on a battlefield. This suggests he was killed by an arrow, sword, or spear as in ancient combat. Isaiah said that Rahab was cut, which alludes to the use of a sharp piercing weapon, such as a sword or spear. The prophet also indicated that the dragon was wounded by a piercing weapon. The Hebrew original, translated in the King James Version as wounded, means to pierce. Other translations are more literal and retain the piercing nature of the wound. Isaiah used the same root to describe the Savior's being pierced by a spear on the cross. The Lord's sword or spear, of course, was the thunderbolt. The Lord held the sword or spear that cut or pierced the dragon with his arm. Scriptural accounts describe his arm as a weapon itself. Isaiah called upon the arm of the Lord to show its mighty strength as it did in the ancient days, a reference to the Exodus. The Lord's arm was an instrument of deliverance and judgment. It was the Lord's arm that broke the dragon in pieces and scattered Israel's enemies. Like the sword and spear, the arm was a thunderbolt. With it came devouring fire, tempest, and hailstones. The strong arm of the Lord was stretched out in the heavens, and with its hand caused the great terrors of the Exodus. The hand itself was also stretched forth and redeemed Israel from the bondage of Egypt. The outstretched arm and hand were not a temporary flash like lightning. It persisted in the heavens. The Lord promised Jeremiah that he would use his outstretched hand and strong arm in the prophet's time. The Lord's holy arm was visible to the nations of the entire world. One of the nations of the ancient world that knew of the arm and hand of the Lord was Egypt. The heavenly arm was included in Egypt's hieroglyphic writing system. The single outstretched arm denoted action. As far as historical linguists can ascertain, hieroglyphics developed hundreds of years before the Exodus. This means that the arm of the Lord, upon which the outstretched arm glyph was based, was present in the heavens well before the Exodus. One Egyptian hieroglyph was an outstretched arm holding a stick. The name of the glyph is arm with the power stick. The stick has been called a baton, mace, or scepter. The glyph is entirely consistent with Moses and Aaron stretching forth their hands with the rod of God to enact the plagues upon Egypt. Moses and Aaron stretching forth of their hands and arms with the rod in power was a ritual performance in imitation of the outstretched arm and hand in heaven. The ordinance called forth the power of the heavenly arm of the Lord. Another example of a ritual performance of the outstretched arm occurred in the battle with Amalek. In this case, with the help of Aaron and Hur, Moses extended his hand with the rod to heaven. When fully outstretched, the power of the arm and rod of Moses ensured victory over Amalek. Roman legions carried standards representative of the planetary archetypes of the polar configuration. In this modern reenactment, soldiers carry the standard or signum. The standard is a long pole with medallions of concentric circles, Mars and Venus nestled within the larger sphere of Saturn. The lower medallion includes the crescent of Saturn. The three or more circular medallions along the pole mimic the planets in alignment along the polar Axis Mundi. Atop the pole is the finial. It is an upright hand within a laurel wreath. This is the hand of the planetary god, Mars, the patron deity of Rome. It ensured strength, power, and victory, just as the Hebrew hand of God did in the hands of Moses and Aaron. This scene from the frieze of Trajan's column in Rome displays two examples of the authentic battle standards with the hand finial. The standard represents the outstretched hand or arm of God seen by all the nations of the world at the Exodus. The pillar, or Axis Mundi, became the legionary pole or the rod of God used by Moses and Aaron. The plasma streamers of Venus became the hand and its fingers. The hand and arm were literally stretched out from the earth to the heavens. The powerful hand and arm of God, the hand and arm that saved the Israelites, was the right. The right hand and arm of the Lord was both high, meaning in the heavens above, and glorious, meaning it shone brightly as plasma does. The right arm and hand of Moses with the rod was a terrestrial extension of the heavenly right arm and hand. The heavenly hand of God was formed by the plasma streamers emanating from Venus. They were the hand's fingers. Most often, the plasma jets were uniform and symmetrical, like in this recreation. However, at times, one of the jets was shorter than the others, either because of the perspective of the earthbound observer or simply because the jet itself was shorter. The shortened streamer looked like a thumb. In this rock art depiction of the hand of God, drawn from observation, the thumb is on the right side. From the vantage point of the observer, this looks as if the hand is the left hand. Placing a left hand on the petroglyph matches. But the hand is extended from the celestial arm and faces the observer. This makes it the right hand of God. There are examples in rock art that depict what should be considered the left hand of God. Of course, God has two hands, and the ancient planetary archetypes support this reality. However, the right hand of God was likely dominant in the heavens and became the symbol of God's power, authority, and righteousness, among other things. Mormon made it abundantly clear that the powerful sword of justice was held by Christ in his right and not his left. The outstretched arm and the right hand of God were the powers behind the plagues and other catastrophes of the Exodus, including parting the Sea of Passage and slaying the dragon, Leviathan. According to Jeremiah's record, this same outstretched arm, and presumably the same right hand, were the creative power behind the creation of the earth and life upon it. The Lord made this claim to the prophet. Jeremiah later acknowledged in a prayer the role of the Lord's outstretched arm in the creation, adding that the arm also was instrumental in forming the heaven, referring to the planets above earth. The Lord declared to Israel through the prophet Isaiah that he laid the foundation of the earth, measured and spread out the heavens. At times, the fingers of the hand of God separated and spread apart, as this representation from Veracruz demonstrates. This is the imagery used for the Lord's spanning the heavens as a hand. The original Hebrew, translated literally, means that the fingers of the hand spread out. The intended meaning is that the hand and its fingers were spread to use it to measure the heavens. Isaiah used the same imagery earlier when the span of God's hand is used to measure heaven. It was the heavenly span that became the prototype of the terrestrial unit of measure, as above, so below. When the Lord laid the earth's foundation and spread out the heavens with his hand, his voice in heaven called out the planets, which stood up together. By the planets standing up together, Isaiah is describing the ancient creation story, where the ancient planet gods first appeared in the heaven together, or more precisely, in alignment.
Then the emergence or clarification of a vast sphere called heaven when heaven was close to the earth. Then the differentiation of male and female aspects in conjunction as a central eye, heart, or soul, the primeval seed of creation.
As they appeared, there was a great sound in heaven, interpreted as a voice. God had called out to the heavens, or planets. This was the word of God, as we have discussed previously. The sound was in effect a tremendous burst of light from Venus.
Then, erupting from the triangular form, a heaven-shattering explosion, remembered as the terrifying glory, a visible, reverberating shout announcing the active phases of creation. The symbols of this violent discharge converge globally, always conveying the idea of radiating fire and light, producing a sea of luminous ejecta, the primeval matter, or raw material of creation.
This burst formed the plasma jets, which eventually formed the rayed crown and the fingers of the hand of God.
The explosive outflow gave the appearance of protection around an invulnerable spot, the location of the warrior god, the celestial prototype of the warrior king on earth. The symbolism is universal and found its broadest expression in the radiant crown of kings. The crown signified the primeval glory, the centerpiece of creation mythology, and for the same reason it meant the conjunction or marriage of the king and the goddess.
The powerful outstretched arm and mighty hand will return at the apocalypse, pouring out the fury of that day. It will parallel the exodus of ancient times. All nations shall once again see the holy arm of the Lord as he bears it in the heavens. As the polar configuration reconstitutes, so will the outstretched arm and right hand of God. The arm and hand will assist in gathering Israel as a shepherd gathers his flock. With his arm as the rod-like scepter, Jesus Christ shall rule. The arm of God shall come down upon the earth with flame, devouring fire, scattering, tempest, and hailstone, meaning bolides.